was not sympathetic to your point of view, and how do you kind of, is he come around? And how do you deal with that? And my second question and point is, I was listening to a radio show and they were talking about how the prison industry, number one, wrote that bill in Arizona,
Yes.
SB 1070, and are targeting now immigrant women and children for incarceration.
Yes.
Is this a new twist on this horrible thing?
Yes, I mean, I'm glad you, I wish I had remembered to bring that up. I'm glad you mentioned it. Yeah, there was a wonderful piece done by NPR, which I encourage you to look up online, last week about the fact that the largest private prison company in the United States actually drafted the Arizona immigration law and lobbied heavily for it because they believed that if it was passed, it would allow them to build new prisons for women and children who were suspected, illegal immigrants, and that they were, seeking to profit from, the roundup of suspected illegal immigrants by housing them, and believed that if the law was passed, there would be an ongoing market for the warehousing of suspected illegal immigrants. And that same kind of dynamic has occurred with respect to drug war policies and legislation as well. As for my husband, he's a federal prosecutor, and we have different views on this. I can't speak for him, and we've kind of made a promise for the sake of our marriage that we won't characterize each other's views in public. I think, though, that he does, readily acknowledge that there is a lot of bias in the system and that it can do enormous harm. He believes, however, that it's important to have people like him in the position of being able to exercise discretion in a positive way within the system, and that we need good prosecutors in the system. That you'd rather have someone like him in the job than someone who is hostile to the communities that are cycling in and out of the system. And so, we've had some discussions about it, as you can imagine, but for the sake of our marriage, we choose to argue over who's going to change diapers more than who's right or wrong ultimately about reform of the criminal justice system.
We have time for maybe 3 more questions. There's actually a mic in the back, so there's a queue. So if you do want to ask a question, I would just encourage you to go to the back. You in the red.
All right, my question is, why is it that they keep on returning the drugs and things to the population? Is that just to keep us locked down and keep us away from each other?
I'm sorry, can you restate? I was having trouble hearing you. If you could speak right into the mic.
My question is, why is it that the drugs keep getting returned back into the population? Is that just to keep us locked down or keep us away from each other? You can't make good people if, you keep returning the drugs back into the population.
When you say returning the drugs, tell me more about, are you talking about, how drugs wind up in inner city communities in the first place?
It's not just the make of the drugs. It's like people can make the drugs, but police, they take them away from us. And then they come right back into
Oh, I see, yes.
Right from where they began.
Yes. Yes, well, the whole practice of seizing drugs and then selling them back to the community in undercover operations, I think, is highly questionable, as well as, putting, so many people on the government payroll to snitch on, suspected drug offenders. I mean, there's, I spent some time in the book, not a lot, talking about how these drug operations are conducted and how the federal government uses really what amount to entrapment type strategies to sell drugs and get convictions, and also to ensure that once someone's swept into the system and arrested, that they'll snitch on their friends and their family members, et cetera, in order to avoid harsh mandatory minimum sentences. And You know, obviously, if the drug war were truly motivated by a concern about drug use, abuse, and addiction, we wouldn't be putting so many drugs back into the communities through these undercover operations. We would be devoting far more resources to drug treatment, which has been slashed in the drug war. You know, you think if you're concerned about drug use and abuse, you'd be funding drug treatment, but instead we've slashed drug treatment and instead, you know, invested our money into these types of law enforcement operations and building more prisons.
They want to lock my brother and my sister up for trying to survive in their family.
Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah.
Hi. If mass incarceration is a redesign of legalized racism and discrimination, and now racism has this institutional backing with this politically correct terminology, and few seem to acknowledge it, would you possibly say that we now live in a more precarious situation in terms of race relations than we did during the Jim Crow era?
Yeah, you know, I think there's reasons to worry that challenging mass incarceration will prove more difficult than challenging Jim Crow, because it is so easy for the system to be defended on kind of seemingly colorblind grounds, and it's also easy to make the kind of standard arguments that people opt into the system by choosing to commit crimes, and that, you know, ultimately the system is about crime control, it's not about race. And that those kinds of arguments and rationalizations make mass incarceration more difficult to challenge. My concern, actually, though, isn't so much with the seduction of colorblind rhetoric, but by the fact that the drug war and the criminalization of poor communities of color has turned black and brown communities against themselves. And that, to me, is the biggest barrier to collective action. The fact that there's so much shame and stigma and blame of one another, and so little solidarity and, you know, true kind of community building going on around these issues, that's what worries me, that we'll stay stuck there. You know, blaming one another, blaming young kids who are, you know, dealing drugs or, you know, cycling in and out of the system, you know, focusing our wrath on them rather than channeling, you know, that frustration and that anger towards collective action on behalf of all of us. So in my mind, you know, the colorblind rhetoric can be dealt with through courageous truth-telling and through organizing, but we kind of as communities have to be willing to come together and embrace one another, and as long as we remain silent or divided, collective political action will be difficult or impossible.